Good afternoon, everybody who's here from Allen District. I really appreciate you guys being here. At this time, I want to invite my constitutional team to come up here and introduce themselves so we can get started with our presentation.
Chris, Eagle Hawk, Macha, Yalla Wawa, Kituna, Lakotia, Betsy, Winatakum, Akach, Yapsnihanta, I have Bruias. Echt is Lehon Chawahit. How many speak Lakota there? If we need any interpretations that maybe some words, Washicha words that you need interpreted to Lakota, I'll try my best to do that.
My name is Kimberly Killer. I am from Red Cloud community in the Oglala District. My father was Francis Killer and my mother was Janice Chattelson. I have 2 children and I'm helping with the OST Constitutional Reform Committee. So thank you guys for showing up, and then we appreciate any type of input you guys have, and just even if it's right or wrong, that's why we're here, to get your guys' voice heard. Thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Tony Badun Pofabidi. I am the admin recorder, and I am from the Lakeside community in Oglala District. Thank you.
Hi everybody, my name is Anna Diaz, and I am from Drywood community out in Oglala. I have 3 kids and I currently serve in the treasurer's office, the tribal building, but I'm also the Oglala Dakota County Commissioner for Oglala and Manderson districts. So today we're here to talk about constitutional reform, and any input that you guys can give us would be greatly appreciated in any form. I do ask if you have any questions that we don't cover throughout the presentation. If you write them on your surveys and then give them to us, and we can address them towards the end or throughout the presentation. And also it helps to give us some feedback and helping to help everybody understand. Somebody might have the same question as you and might not get asked, so. Okay, so at this time I'm going to take 5 minutes and just get your input on your dislikes and likes of IRA government. Just anything.
And then I'm going to be writing them over there on that wall, so we have two pieces of paper, and just feel free to say all your dislikes and likes, because that's why we're here. So
if there's nothing else, we'll go through, as you can see, our presentation is broken down into 4 parts, and so we'll go through each section. Don't be scared. If you have questions, raise your hand, ask. Okay. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Tina Merdanian.
So, Mitakyapi, my name is Tina Merdanian, and I come to you as a community member and as a rebuilder. So with that said, they asked me to just share with you a little bit of the history leading up to why do we have an IRA government? Why is this in place? So with that being said, let's go back to 1778. And this is where the first treaties began with what they call the civilized tribes in Delaware, and that confederation of those nations. So in that time frame is when the first treaties were in place. After that, in 1823, more treaties came about because of Marshall's Trilogy. And if any of you are aware of Marshall's Trilogy, was the 3 rulings that Marshall ruled on regarding Indians. And at that time, they were relocating us. And by these 3 cases, defined what is now Indian law for our people. And at this point, also, in the same time frame, one of the oldest forms of the arm of the federal government is the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs was known as Indian Affairs, and they had 2 representatives for this country. And at that time, they were determining how were they going to deal with the Indians. And that's why these treaties become so important, going clear back then. And so these 2 representatives divided up the nation, and this is how they worked with the Indians. So that is one of the oldest forms of an organization under the federal government. Also, with that being said, there was a time frame in which a lot of our people were being pushed westward because of the expansion. And why was they pushing westward? And that's because of the natural resources and the land. And so they were putting a lot of tribes into different sections of the territory, into the regions. And so with that was the removal and the relocation of our people. And sometimes they would put 2 different tribes into one area. And these tribes weren't always allies. Sometimes they were enemies, but they put them in there and they had to coexist within those areas. So that was a part of that removal and relocation. As we know, if you're familiar with the history of the Holocaust, what did they do with the Jews? They removed them. And that's what they did with a lot of our people. Same with the Navajo Nation. So if you think about that history, that happened here in this country before it happened in Germany in regards to the relocation and removal of our Indian people. So understanding this history and all the legislation that came about that enforced this history for our people. And the first agreement, besides the earlier agreements that we made with the U.S. government, first one was in 1823, but it just kind of tried to promote more of peace within our tribal nations. And specific to the Oceti-Sakowin was the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty. And this treaty was very important, and that was because it defined our territory. That was the whole purpose behind this treaty, was defining our territory. And in that treaty, there's only 8 articles, if you look at it. And in those 8 articles is saying how we're going to exist within that territory. So within this timeline, with what has passed, then the next treaty was the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. And with that, established again the land and today what is known as present-day South Dakota. But with the 1868 treaty, what's so important in understanding this is it was to promote peace. And as part of promoting peace was creating the rite of passage. And under this rite of passage, we were, as tribal nations, were given these allotments and allocations. And so under this treaty, we have 17 articles under the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. There are 17 articles under that treaty that defines, again, how we are to exist within these boundaries. But given we went from 8 articles to 17 articles in these treaties. So with that, if you look at the PowerPoint, led to a lot of confrontation because many of our people didn't really agree with what was being signed off on the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. And that led to the Battle of Greasy Grass, the Battle of Little Bighorn. A lot of European historians refer to that as a massacre versus a battle. Whereas with Wounded Knee, which was a repercussion, was a result of greasy grass, came the massacre of Wounded Knee. So all of this is again to have that control, to push our people within these boundaries and to have that rite of passage. So as more and more land was taken from our people by the federal government, federal laws expanded into internal tribal affairs. And what does that mean? Is for the most part, federal government stepped in and they wanted more control. And how did they control us? Through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs was to assist and promote our well-being as Native people. However, that wasn't always the case. It depended on the agent who was assigned to our reservation. And so through there, our children were forced to attend schools. Our lands were allotted, meaning traditionally, we held our land together as a people, as our territories. We defined our boundaries from one mountaintop to the other mountaintop. And why did we do this? And that is because we understood everything that existed between those two ranges. We knew it was a part of ceremony. There was a time in which we traveled, a time where we gathered our medicine, a time where we gathered our food, and a time where we gathered as a people. So that's why these boundaries become so important, because it encompasses, it's a part of who we are as a people and who we are as today as a people. And so after that, being forced into these smaller parameters, then the federal government allowed our people to finally vote in 1924. And that's because a lot of our people served in World War I. So with that being said, as North Dakota and South Dakota moved towards statehood in 1889, we lost 21 million acres of reservation land as a part of the Allotment Act. So that was basically cutting the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, cutting land base in half. And we were forced into the 6 smaller reservations. So when I said we were broken up into those 6 reservations, you can see that on the map today. So you look at that original land base from the 1851 to the 1868 to what was happening through 1876 to 1877, 1889, and then that's further split. From that time period from 1899 moving forward. So with that being said, our people never gave up on those agreements, those contracts that we signed with the federal government known as treaties. And with that being said, we held on to those original boundaries and holding on to what is sacred to our people, which is the Black Hills. And that went to the Supreme Court in the 1980s. And the Supreme Court ruled it as one of the grave injustices in this nation's history. However, what the courts were ruling on was not to give the land back, but for our people to get compensated for the taking of that land. And that's why they have this account that sits there with millions of dollars, because our people never accepted that money. And we will never, I say that as a tribal people, agree to accept that money, because then we would be giving up those Black Hills. So with that being said, there's been a lot of rumors out there. You heard it on Keeley, you kind of heard it in the papers, maybe on the news, that Tribal Council, the Oglala Sioux Tribal Council, was giving up the Black Hills, was signing away the Black Hills. Well, that is not true. For the most part, you got to remember, your Tribal Council representatives are from the Pine Ridge Reservation, and are from the Oceti-Sakowin. So we will fight to continue to protect those original territories. Yes?
Something to add to that.
Yes.
Just in furtherance of that, I don't remember the year, but there was the Oglala Sioux tribe wasn't in all of the other tribes were in with the lawsuit, but Oglala Sioux tribe didn't get in on that. So we're not even named in the next lawsuit to try to get back the Black Hills. So even if that were true, it wouldn't include us because we weren't even in the lawsuit. We were the only ones to say no. So.
And Stephanie's correct. And actually, when that went to the people within the other reservations up north, they wanted to sign off on it. They wanted to get that money. However, it was tribal council who turned around and fought against giving away that portion of the Black Hills. So just got to remember there's always has to be a balance in regards to tribal government and its people. So with that being said, the reorganization period, what the federal government was saying, how do I reorganize these people? Now we placed them onto reservations. What are we going to do with them? We signed these treaties with them. We owe them these allotments, the land allotments, as well as the resources. For example, those allocations. So with that being said, they had to come up with a plan. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs kept saying, well, where are the experts? Where are the experts on running their natural resources, their forestry, their fishing, all of this? And they were also saying, where are the experts in educating their children? Because we're the ones running their schools. And we're the experts in determining their social services, because we're the ones running it. And then there was a report that came out. It's called the Merriam Report. It's dubbed the Merriam Report, which listed all of the shortfalls that the BIA was enforcing upon our people on these reservations. And as a result of that came the IRA. But with that being said, the federal government, you have to kind of understand what was going on within that time frame. There was also a time of termination and relocation where they were moving our people off the reservations. They wanted them to decrease that land base again, and they were relocating them off the reservation. As a result, 100 tribes no longer exist. They took them off the federal registry as tribal nations. They no longer exist. And today, there's over 40% of our relatives who still live off the reservation. But what we're also finding is that they're coming back, they're coming home, and their children are coming home, and they're coming home to retire. So with that being said, our people always recognize these boundaries. And I know, like, for example, when I go off to another state for business or whatever, it doesn't matter what boundary I'm coming into, whether it's east, west, but once I come into those boundaries, I say I'm home. This is home. And this is because this is where our people are from in our history. So abuse and termination and relocation period led to reforms. And these were legislation that passed by Congress. As many of you are aware, this didn't happen until the 60s, 70s. And that was the federal government expanded the powers of tribal self-government, restored the recognition of tribes. It was the Indian Civil Rights Act, the Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, and then the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. That was a mouthful. So today, This is what the Pine Ridge Reservation looks like. And if you look closely, you're going to see a lot of checkerboard from the allotted land to the deeded land. And with that being said, just recently, within our tribal nations, we had the land buyback. And we're still waiting to see what those maps look like today under the land buyback. Because for the most part, what is tribal land and then what is going to be allotted land. So it's going to be interesting to see that. So that moves us on to part 2. And part 2 is understanding the IRA, the Indian Reorganization Act, originally known as the Wheeler-Howard Act of 1934. So Anna, if you want to take this over, or...
The Wheeler-Howard Act consists of 17 articles. It has 17 articles, correct?
Right, 17.
It has 17 articles. So here you can see there's Title I, which is the establishment of tribal governments, tribal laws, chartered businesses throughout all the tribal nations. And then Title II is the education, Indian preference in the BIA. 3 is repeals allotment systems and the money for new trust lands. And Title IV under the Howard-Wheeler Act is the establishment of tribal court systems. So this is the Howard-Wheeler Act. I know it's really hard to see. Is there a printout in the... There's copies in the package that you guys received. If you guys want to take a closer look at that and read it more in depth. So purpose of the IRA for Indians, termination of the Allotment Act of 1877, the conservation and development of Indian land and resources was imparted the right to form business and or other organizations. It helped to establish a credit system and granted certain rights of home rule, and also provided for vocational education and other purposes. Terms of the IRA explained. So these are just some of the terms and conditions in which we have to follow under IRA in order to be a tribal government. It talks about the trust period, surplus lands, allotments, claims against the U.S., Indian preference, tribal incorporation, just all of these different things that we have to follow. The trust period. Lands in trust and restriction on alienation were extended and continued until otherwise directed by Congress. This restriction on alienation means that trust land cannot be sold. The trust period was extended indefinitely. This is a result of the land being lost when fee patents were issued and allottees could not pay the taxes, so the lands are sold by the state or county. Surplus lands and easements. Surplus lands, if in public interest, the Secretary of Department of Interior is authorized to restore to tribal ownership the remaining surplus lands of any Indian reservation, or authorized to be open to sell, or any other form of disposal by presidential proclamation or by any of the public land laws of the United States. Easement shall restrict the granting or use of permits for easements or rights of way or ingress or egress over the lands for all proper and lawful purposes. Prohibition, I can't even say that word, of selling Indian lands. No sales, no gift exchange or any other transfer of restricted Indian lands or of shares and assets of any Indian tribe or corporation organized here under shall be made or approved. Jeez, this is a mouthful. Except to tribes with the approval of Secretary of the Interior, lands may be sold, devised, or transferred to the Indian tribe in which the lands or shares are located, or from which the shares were derived, or to a successor corporation. Voluntary exchanges. The Secretary may authorize voluntary exchanges or equal value of shares of shares of equal value whenever such exchange is expedient and beneficial for compatibility with the proper consolidation of Indian lands and the benefit of cooperative organizations. Rights of the Department of the Interior. Secretary of the Interior is authorized to acquire through purchase, relinquishment, gift, exchange, or assignment any interest in lands, water rights, or surface rights to lands within or out of existing reservations, including trusts and otherwise restricted allotments, for the purpose of providing lands for Indians. Directives of the Secretary of Interior is to make rules and regulations for operation and management of Indian forestry units, restricting the number of cattle grazed on Indian range, promulgates such other rules and regulations as may be necessary to protect the range from deterioration, overgrazing, any improper uses. Recognition of new reservations. The Secretary of Interior is authorized to proclaim new Indian reservations on lands acquired pursuant to any authority conferred by this act, or to add such lands to existing reservations, which means it just gives us the authority to make our reservations bigger. Allotments, homesteads, and public domain. Nothing contained in this act shall be construed to relate to Indian holdings of allotment or homesteads upon the public domain outside the geographic boundaries of any Indian reservation now existing or established hereafter. Establish funds for tribes, loans, and education. Organizing tribes. The purpose is for expenses of organizing Indian chartered corporations or other organizations created under this act. Revolving loans from which the Secretary of the Interior, he regulates, under such rules and regulates as he may prescribe. They have the power to make loans basically to Indian chartered corporations to promote economic development within the tribe. Higher education. Basically, it's a credit loan program for tuition and other expenses, and recognize vocational and trade schools for Native students and high school and college. Higher education to appointment to vacancies and any such positions. Wow, exclusions and allowances. So, the exclusions are the, let's see, provisions of this act shall not apply to any of the territories, colonies, or insular possessions of the United States. And then the allowances of the Secretary of Interior, okay, so allowances are the allotment of the land given to each person, the head of households. Non-application says this act shall not apply to any reservation wherein a majority of the adult Indians voting at a special election duly called by the State of Interior shall vote against the application. Claims against the U.S. Nothing in this act shall be construed to impair or prejudice any claim or suit of any Indian tribe against the United States. Tribe sharing reservations. Any Indian tribe or tribes residing on the same reservations shall have the right to organize for its common welfare and may adopt any appropriate constitution and bylaws which shall become effective when ratified. Just meaning that if there's two tribes in the same area, they just have to meet in what's best for the people. Constitutional powers. Basically, the right to employ legal counsel, the choice of counsel, the right to elect who you want, to prevent the sale, disposition, or lease of tribal lands, to maintain interest for the lands and other tribal assets without the consent of the tribe, to negotiate with the federal government, state and local governments as well, for the best interest of the people. Tribal incorporation. Secretary of Interior may, upon petition by at least 1/3 of the adult Indians, issue a charter of incorporation to such tribe, provided that a charter should not become operative until ratified at a special election by majority vote. Your such charter may convey to the incorporated tribe the power to purchase, take gift, further powers may be incidental to the conduct of corporate business. Any charter should not be revoked or surrendered except by an act of Congress. Surplus lands and easements. If in a tribal interest, the Secretary of DOI is authorized to restore to tribal ownership the remaining surplus lands of any Indian reservation opened or authorized to be open to sell or any other form of disposal by presidential proclamation. However, valid rights or claims of any persons to any lands so withdrawn existing on the date of the withdrawal shall not be affected by this act. Let's see, further, this section shall not apply to the lands within any reclamation project. It does not apply to lands within, is that a repeat? It is. Easements contained shall restrict the granting or use of permits for easements or right of way or ingress or egress over the lands for all proper and lawful purposes. Prohibition of selling Indian lands, no sales, devise, gift, exchange, or any other transfer of restricted Indian lands or of shares in the assets of Indian tribe or corporation organized shall be made or approved, except to tribes or voluntary exchanges. Rights of the Department of Interior. The Secretary of Interior is authorized to acquire through purchase, relinquishment, gift, exchange, assignment, water rights, surface rights of lands, including trust or other restricted allotments, whether the allottee be living or deceased, for the purpose of providing lands for Indians. Trust status and tax exempt. Title to any lands or rights acquired pursuant to this act shall be taken in the name of the United States in trust for the Indian tribe or individual Indian for which the land is acquired. Such land or rights shall be exempt from the state or local taxation. That's basically, if you're native, you don't have to pay taxes on your land, especially here within Oglala, Dakota County. I know also with the tax exempt status, schools are tax exempt, churches, cemeteries, if any of those are on your land, then those are tax exempt. And I know the churches are allotted 10 acres and then 5 acres for cemetery. Or actually no, it's for one cemetery in whole. So these large churches that have bigger cemeteries, only 5 acres of their overall cemetery acreage is actually tax exempt. Directives of Secretary of State: make rules and regulations for operation and management, restrict the number of livestock raised on Indian range units, promulgates such other rules and regulations as necessary to protect range deterioration. Basically just making sure the land isn't overgrazed with all the cattle and livestock that are out there. Recognition of new reservations. Secretary of State is authorized to proclaim new Indian reservations on lands acquired, provided that these lands added to existing reservations. Basically, reservation has to be there before they'll recognize the new lands added on. I know a couple of slides back we talked about, or I read through the expanding your reservation through acquired lands, and this is where all of that comes into play. Allotments, homesteads, and public domain. Nothing contained in this act shall be construed to relate to Indian holdings of allotments or homesteads upon public domain outside of the geographic boundaries of any Indian reservation now existing or established hereafter. Allocated funds for tribes, revolving loan fund, and education. Organizing tribes. Purpose is for expenses of organizing Indian chartered corporations or other organizations created under this act. The revolving loans from which the Secretary of Interior, under such rules and regulations, may make loans to Indian chartered corporations to promote economic development of such tribes and their members, and defray the expenses of administering such loans. Most of these loans are for ranchers. Higher education, created a loan program for tuition and other expenses, and recognized vocational and trade school loans to Indian students in high school and college, later exchanged to grants for higher education. Indian preference in civil service. Established standards of age, health, character, experience, knowledge, and ability for Indians who may be appointed without regard to civil service laws. Such qualified Indians hereafter have the preference to appointment to vacancies in any such positions. So here, Tina's gonna go over part 3 of the Constitution.
Okay. So what Anna just gave you was all the reasons why we have the programs that we have today. So when we talked about education loans, well, that is today our higher ed, because no longer were we giving out loans, we were able to go after grant monies from the federal government to be able to supply higher ed. And then today the tribe also has voc educational. So you can apply for that program if you're going to go to vocational school. So that's a result. All of these things that she listed out, example, the grazing. Today the tribal government has a grazing code that we abide by and that we work with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The grazing code gives the tribe authority in regards to those leases, whereas before the tribe never had the input when it came to the grazing codes. So with that being said, this is why within our Constitution, how many articles do we have in our Constitution, the Oglala Sioux Tribal Constitution? 17. 17 articles in the OST Constitution. How many of you know when the last Constitution revision was done? 2008. It's up here. The last constitutional revision was done in 2008. So what I want to do is this table shows you what got revised in 2008. And like I said, the Constitution has 17 articles. So when you look at this table, what it's telling you is that Article 1 is territory, and that was not revised in our Constitution. So if you look at our Constitution, and I gave you guys all a copy of the Constitution, it doesn't really define our boundaries in Article 1. It's really broad. It doesn't include our 51. It doesn't include our 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. But in 2008, the territory boundaries was not revised. It remained the same. Article 2 is membership. And within that, there's only 2 sections that define our membership as the Oglala Sioux tribe, as tribal citizens. Now, there are other tribal nations who define their membership, like the Navajo Nation and the Cherokee. And their population, their membership is very, very high. Now, why is that? Because it goes back to what Anna was talking about. It talks about those allocations, those allowances is tied to our membership. So the more numbers you have, the more money that comes down to those different allotments, okay? Allotments of money. So that's why it's very important as a people we look at membership. And currently the enrollment committee revised the enrollment code. And in the enrollment code, they are defining our membership by family lineage, by your family tree. If you can prove in your family tree, then you can, your child, grandchild can be enrolled within the Oglala Sioux tribe. Before, there was blood quantum, and there's always questions about blood quantum. Now, where did that come from? Blood quantum. It came from the Willard Howard Act of 1934. In there, if you read in there, in that article, it states that we have to be 1/2 to be an enrolled member. That's where it came from. We never defined that. That's what was defined by the federal government. So today, tribal government, through the enrollment committee, took out the blood quantum, and now it's just family lineage. However, in 2008, that section wasn't revised. So when they did the revision, only 8 of the 9 articles were revised. And so with that, the sections that were revised, Article 3 was not touched. Article 3 has 10 sections, and that's the governing body. That's Tribal Council, Article 3. Article 4 is the powers of the council. What rights do we have? And there's 3 sections in there, but section 1 has 23 subsections. And with that, in 2008, section 1, subsection B changed, and they added the Bill of Rights to Article 12. So prior to 2008, there was no Article 12 because we did not have the Bill of Rights. So in 2008, Article 12 was added, which is the People's Bill of Rights. So with that being said, we had revisions in 1I, 1N, and 1W was added. And sections 1, 2, and 3 were revised, and they added sections 4 through 7 in that revision. Article 5, judicial powers. And that is, there are 7 sections in judicial powers. And that was revised in 2008. Article 6 is our districts. That's what defines our districts, is Article 6. And in Article 6, there's only 1 section. And that was not revised in 2008. In 1996, Article 6 was revised. So I strongly encourage you to take a look at our Constitution and see what it says in regards to our districts in Article 6. Article 7 is our elections. We have an election code, and that wasn't revised. Article 8 is the removal of officers. That was not revised in 2008. Article 9 is the referendum. That was not revised in 2008. Article 10 is land. And if you listen to the Willard-Howard Act of 1934, it talked a lot about land, right? Everything from the leases to how you recapture land to how the land was going to be run. While in Article 10 of the OST Constitution, there are 13 sections. And in Article 10, that was not revised. And there's been a lot of discussion around Article 10 because it hasn't been revised for so long that it really doesn't meet the needs of the people today. Recently, Tribal Council approved revisions of Chapter 35, which is the grazing code. That got revised this administration, approved, I should say, this administration. So with that being said, it's not reflected in our Constitution, those changes. And what we've seen with other tribal nations who did constitutional reform is that they did not really look at those articles and the changes that they did. And what had happened is sometimes the articles conflict with each other. And they didn't, when you change an article, it gets rid of all of those ordinances that were passed by Tribal Council. It supersedes it. And what was happening is they were using old ordinances even though the article changed in their constitution. So that's why it's so important. That's why I'm giving you the background of what got changed and what didn't get changed in 2008. So with that, Article 11 is the amendments within the Constitution, and that's only one section. And the amendments of the Constitution basically says is, we're going to get into detail of all of these articles. So I'm not going to go into too much depth. And then Article 12 is the Bill of Rights. There's one section with 10 subsections. And Article 13 is the responsibility of the Executive Committee. And who's our Executive Committee? That's our President, our Vice President, our Secretary, our Treasurer, and our 5th member. This defines their responsibilities in office as an Executive Committee. So with that, we move on to Article 14, which is the qualifications of Tribal Council. And in 2008, there's only one section, and they removed Section 2, and they combined 1 and 2, the language. So that's what got revised in 2008. So with that, we're moving on to the oath of office. That remained the same. And Article 16, there's 5 sections. Sections 1 through 4 got revised, and they added Section 5. And then moving on, they added Article 17. It has 0 sections. It's only 1 sentence. So I strongly recommend that you take a look at it. Article 17. So with that, let's go into depth. Article 1 is the territory and the jurisdiction. The jurisdiction of the Oglala Sioux tribe shall extend to the territory within the original confines of the Pine Ridge Reservation. So what does that mean? That means we're agreeing to those reservation parameters. And so, is that we as a people agree with? Or do we want to change that? And that's up to you. You have that questionnaire. This is your opportunity where you can start writing in what you feel Article 1, the changes in Article 1 should be. Article 2 is membership. and as I talked about that, today, under Section 1, it says that membership of the Oglala tribe shall be automatic when the person names appears on the official rolls, and that was in 1935, or a child is born to any member of the Oglala Sioux tribe. So that we're talking again about family history, that family lineage. And Part B is what applies to us today as a people. Section 2, the tribal council shall have the authority to adopt laws covering future membership. So it's tribal government that can define our membership of our people within the Pine Ridge Reservation. Article 3 is the governing body. Sections 1 through 10 describes the governing body of the tribal council. And we heard about one dislike of the governing body of the IRA, and that is they didn't answer their phones, right? So what should be the responsibilities of the governing body? How should they be set up? How should tribal council be set up? And how should they function as a tribal government? So I strongly encourage you to take a look at that and say, there's a lot of discussion out there. Some people talk about tribal councils should have 4-year staggered terms. Some people say, leave it as it is. Don't touch it. Keep it 2-year terms. So there's a lot of different thoughts out there on how tribal government should be composed. So that's something for you to look at and give your thoughts to when it's talking about tribal government, because this is your opportunity to make that change. Article 4 is the powers of the council. And in that, there's sections 1 through 3 that describes how tribal councils shall exercise their power in negotiating with governments, to employ legal counsel, to approve or veto sale of land, to advise the Secretary of the Interior, to make assignments of tribal land, and to manage economic affairs, enterprises, and to appropriate for public purses, levy taxes, license fees, to remove trespassers and exclude and banish persons, to enact resolutions, ordinances, etc. So this is saying how we function, our roles and our responsibilities as tribal government. So in there, it says that tribal government has the right to remove people from the reservation. So right now, there is an ordinance in place that says if somebody wants to remove somebody from the reservation, native or non-native, it says that the president or the vice president has to deem it as necessary, and once that happens, then it goes to tribal council. That's the process. So you have to understand there's ordinances. And what are ordinances? There are laws as a people. So as tribal council, we have to follow our laws that have been written by previous administrations. Article 5 is judicial powers, and we hear a lot of discussion about judicial powers. In 2008 was the separation of powers. That happened in those revisions. On paper, the separation of powers. However, today, there's not a process to implement that true separation of powers. Some people say there needs to be a separation of powers not just between the judicial, but also the executive and the legislative. Because right now, there is no separation from the executive and the legislative branch. Article 6 is the district organizations. And it talks about the districts. And it lists out the 9 districts within the Pine Ridge Reservation. In 1997, there was a revision in the Constitution, and they took out a few words in that revision. And when they did that, what it did is, in a way, it did not recognize those boundaries that were defined by the districts. That happened in 1997. So today, if you look at Article 6, it has nothing in place to say these are the boundaries of the districts. And so Tribal Council needs to look at that as well, and how we are elected by our districts as representatives. Article 8 is the elections. This just describes the eligibility to vote in election and how Tribal Council shall determine the place and time. There is an election code. We do have an election office in place. And at this time, I believe Law and Order is working on the election code so it better meets the people in the communities as well. Just to touch on the election code, the other thing is we, in Tribal Council, there was some discussion that some of the districts don't have their election code in place, the districts themselves. And so if they don't have an election code in place, they file the Tribal Council's, the tribal government's election code. And what happens is that if they do not run their elections at the same time as the general and the primary and the general election, and some of them have their elections like in April and June, then the district is responsible for the cost of those elections. There is, upon a petition, 1/3 of the eligible voters of the Oglala Sioux tribe, or upon request of the majority members of the Tribal Council, can enact, propose ordinances or resolutions of the council, and shall be submitted to popular referendum. So this is talking about the secretarial election. There's two ways a secretarial election can happen. And it's not just through Tribal Council to approve it, but if we have 1/3 of the eligible voters to petition, then there can be a secretarial election. So there's two ways to do that. Yes? So that's a very good question. She asked, what would that number be for 1/3 of our population? Eligible voter population, okay? So each district should have a census, right? How many people reside in their community? But how can they determine that when their boundaries are not recognized? Because that was changed in 1997. So what would that population base be? So you go back to the enrollment and see how many people are enrolled in each of those communities. That will give you that percentage, because we have to go by enrollment of eligible voters. And that number fluctuates all the time. So I cannot give you honestly what that number would be. Okay, Article 10. This lists out all the sections, everything from the allotted land, tribal lands, leasing of tribal lands, to assignments, and so you can go through all of this. However, I want to bring to your attention that it's important to keep this in mind when we're looking at revisions, because for the most part, remember when I talked about the land buyback? And a lot of our tribal membership had chosen to sell their fractionated land, and there's a lot of people who no longer own land, and what they call in our Constitution landless Indians. Tribal government, according to the current Constitution, has the authority to give assignments of land to the landless Indian. So when you look at these articles, I strongly encourage you to really review them. Because how does it work for our people today? And then the other thing is, because a lot of people had sold their fractionated land, they're needing home site leases. And home site leases within their community. And some of them choose to go to another location, another community. And so when they do that, they have to prove their residency in that community based upon that district's constitution. Some districts say you have to live there for a year before you're considered a resident there in that community. So these leases for home sites, also people want to build a home, but they don't own land. And they have to go after a mortgage to lease that land and to build a house there. And to get a mortgage, you need a guarantee by the banks, the lending agency, of 25 to 30 years. And according to our leases, we don't have that. We don't have the 30-year leases. We only have the 5-year leases. So what tribal government tried to do is work with the agencies, the lending agencies, and saying, okay, we'll give them a 30-year lease, but it has to be renewed every 5 years. And some of the lending agencies are not okay with that. So a lot of our people are stuck because they're trying to get a mortgage and they can't do that because of the land lease, home site lease, because we would be going against our constitution if we gave them a 30-year lease. So does that really fit who we are as a people today based upon the revisions in 2008? Article 11 talks about the amendments within the Constitution. And again, that's 30% of those entitled to vote shall make amendments. So things that we send out for referendum vote to the people. For example, there was a survey that went out to the people, and it was viewed as a referendum vote on alcohol. And it was very controversial. According to the survey, our people wanted to legalize alcohol on the reservation. But it wasn't a clear referendum vote. So that's something, a lesson to learn from in regards to how we put out there the referendum vote to our people so that they understand.
I have a question. How is it not a referendum?
My understanding, okay, my understanding, and the question was why wasn't it a referendum vote? What was the difference? The understanding is that when it went out to the people, it was to be labeled as a survey to get their input. However, that part was not communicated. So to the general public, it was viewed as a true referendum vote. So when it came back to tribal council to accept that referendum, they said it wasn't a referendum at all. It was just a survey. And that was the understanding with the information that was given to me.
So that in fact, the game void and have the whole election process that they went through to have that process selected.
Exactly. It was voided.
Now, usually you have a legal representation that says that this is an opinion by whoever, attorney general. Why wasn't that like that? I mean, is that kind of like let this go because then those of us, a handful of us can more on an illegal referendum. I guess that's what I want to know. How was that? We were led to believe that we were having a referendum in the past and nothing happened. Same thing with the our have already been answered. Now, so you know, I was telling Chris here, I said, Antoinette went up there, I said, I had my engine all torn apart, I said, I'm having meetings, so I had to put it together, come up with this meeting to revise the Constitution, because that's I guess my question is, we revised it, nothing happened. Why was that not alerted to us here in districts that this is only a survey, but we're going to hold this big general election? Why is that? We talked about conflicting one amendment with another article. That wasn't clear.
Okay. So let's go back, and I think in general, your question is, you know, in regards to what we're doing now. So what happened in 2008 with the constitutional revision was that constitutional revision was not done by the people per se. It was done by tribal government. Tribal government determined what articles they wanted to revise. Then, once they make those revisions, they sent it to the Secretary of Interior. Secretary of Interior turned around and then it said, okay, we approve these amendments, because remember, it has to go through the Secretary of Interior. Secretary of Interior then comes back with the Secretary of Election. That's when all of those ballots were sent out to the people. A lot of the people marked off on that. And if you look at the Constitution, when you see those revisions in the back, it'll say 1/3, and it gives an amount, how many people voted on that particular revision. And not a lot of people were familiar with all of these changes that had taken place by tribal government to make these revisions. So learning lesson from that time frame to now is the fact that with this task force is just a vehicle. It's not tribal government, but to go out there and get the people's voice as to what needs to be changed in the Constitution. And then how are we going to get that enforced within tribal government? And so this is the process in which we're working on under this constitutional reform, because it still has to go through the Secretary of Interior, get approval, and then it'll go back out to the people for a secretarial election.
Who's doing this revision? I understand that the purpose of this meeting was to do a revision.
Right.
Not a third grade history lesson there, but I'm confused about this.
Okay, so I'm sorry you're confused, but let me tell you, the history lesson is to give you, for the most part, everybody, they're not all familiar in regards to what had transpired to take place to today, especially our younger generation. And then for moving forward, we are doing revision. We're just giving you the information so that it's up to you. The change, the revision is coming from you the people. And that's why we have the surveys. And on the surveys, it asks about the preamble, all through 17 articles, what you think needs to be revised. Once all of these come back from the districts, the information is going to be compiled. Once that's compiled, we take back the revisions to the people, to all the districts again, and said, this is what you told us you want it changed. You guys agree upon that. Then it goes to tribal council.
Last time that the public notice was hung up here in Allen, you were asking us questions, let me ask you what happens when the public revision took place, and if there was a public notice.
The public notice for this meeting?
No, for this meeting.
2000?
Any kind of revision. Tribal council comes up with all kinds of resolutions and passes on the ordinances. Yeah, they don't know. I mean, you know, and if you understand, let's get back to my fourth grade government class here. Very facetious. Before law was passed, we had a comment period too. I mean, we're following the United States Constitution word for word. And we've never had any kind of comment periods, we've never had any revision of periods and so forth. So that's why we are in dark hours. So you'll see me believe we are disinterested. We just don't know. We're waiting for I'm still waiting for the a survey group or a marketing group or what is that?
I hear you, and I understand. Yeah, and I understand where you're coming from, and I respect what you're saying. And so let me introduce who I am and what we're doing. All of our people who are here presenting and who put this together is tribal membership. We're from here, and we're from different communities, okay? My name is Dr. Valentina Merdanian. I'm from the Oglala District. I'm here as a tribal member. I'm here as a Native Nation rebuilder to help present the information. But keep in mind that, you know, I also sit on the task force that's trying to get this out to the people, to provide an opportunity to welcome all the people's voices for this change.
Well, I thank you because I didn't know about this until Antoinette came up to my place and I was working on the car. Otherwise, yeah, I have some interest in revision that 30% is really going to be a tough one to follow because what we have here in Allen, so I understand you are a representative from Oglala, correct? Okay. We had a resolution that was approved by one of our local communities. That's what our district. And then it went to the district council. District council approved it. The district council sent it to council. And again, we don't know what happened to it, but I'm understanding that it was tabled. And I don't know if it was Jim or Lydia that made the motion to table this resolution. Now that's what we want to know is the representatives and yourself. Are you empowered to tell the districts what to do, or are you a representative of the district that's supposed to promote and advance what the district wants because we're such a large tribe? Okay, that is my question now. We have that here, and boy, we just don't know where we are. You know? So I thank you for trying this, but you know, we need to find out what the vision is that we want to do. And I think that we talked about the 1851 treaty and the 1868 treaty. Now, if we know that treaty, all those answers that we have here are in there. You know, we talk about people that live off the reservation, those are all in there. We talk about land assignments, those are all in that treaty, the 1868 treaty. Now, you got to remember that this was an interpretation, right? Of Indian. And so how did that white man interpret to the Indian? So the rulings have always been what were the Indians thinking at the time of this decision, right? Okay, so we as members here, we know our relatives. We know what they were thinking when they made this constitution. At least I remember this treaty. Okay, and one example of that is in our 1868 treaty, we talk about railroads. So we're going to have a board, we're going to have a commission that's going to consist of an Indian, a white person, and a disinterested member of the party. It's going to be usually three. Okay, now, when my great-grandparents voted on that and elected to have it done, don't you think that they were saying a disinterested member is not another white person? Because why would they say that when we're going to be outvoted 2-1 every time, right? Okay, here's my understanding of what a disinterested person was. And I thought maybe this is what this is going to entail. A disinterested person back in 1868, from what I understand from my great-grandfather, great-grandfather who passed this on to us through oral tradition, was at that time, there was a lot of travel, free travel, going from one ocean across the other, Quack, on the other side, land on the other side. That's what the Indian people assumed. I mean, that's what they wanted. They said, we wanted somebody completely disinterested from the other countries across the United States to come in and sit down and listen to this and see if the Indian people are being reversed or if the white man is being greedy, And then we can come to a conclusion, we can talk about it. And yet, no one has ever brought that up. Now, since you are you are a doctor, and I thought maybe that this is kind of a lesson that we would see under the 1868 treaty, instead of saying what the BIA has enforced. The BIA has the right to do this, when it's our fault that the BIA still is in existence. You know, you talked about the 1934 Act, and if we all read that on the internet, it's on the internet. It says that the 1934 Act was a very different meaning when it was introduced back then, and it's in writing. The 1934 Act was to let Indian people start governing themselves. And they were going to put white people in there to tell us how to govern on the white side. Okay, so that's not the fault of the BIA, it's our fault that we didn't do that. Okay, and how I know this is the first tribal council president was my great-grandfather, Robert Banwood. He was the first tribal president. And we followed that through. He allowed us to do this. You know, he talked about selling his horses and selling cows in order to go to Washington, D.C. to make these moves take place, right? Now, so that's, I guess, if we know those things, then we can sit down and attribute our constitutional changes based on our treaty. Now, as I was telling Antoinette, the treaty and the Constitution, or the BIA, are two different organizations. They're not to be commingled, in my opinion. Okay, the tribal council exists because of the treaty. Now, I don't know if you believe that or not, but it's because we have a treaty. They recognize us as a group of Indians. That group of Indians was too much out of control, whatever, from the white side, so they put us in these small organizations so they can teach us how to manage our own affairs. So if we don't do that, it's our own fault. I mean, we always have to go back to the Secretary of the Interior for approval. Okay, so that's I guess my comment here is, and you're going to see. I don't know if Antoinette's still here. Do you still have that little petition that I gave you? See, that petition that I talked about that went to tribal council and got tabled by Jim or Lydia. Who tabled that?
Council.
No, I mean, who made the motion?
I made the motion to approve, no second, that table.
Okay,
I think at that time I was supposed to go back to what's taking place here. So I think
Do you have time to read this? For me to read this?
Sure.
For me to listen to it?
That's why you're here.
Okay, all right. This is addressed to the Superintendent of Bureau of Indian Affairs. It says petition to revise the duties of. You can't hear me?
Why? Just, it's for the see, the recordings. Yeah.
I'm speaking to the camera?
Your sound is being recorded on the camera.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you for the enunciation there. Okay, it says this petition is addressed to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Pioneers Agency. Petition to revise duties and elect the Oglala Sub-Tribal Treasurer at large. That's the petition that went to Tribal Council and got tabled. And under Robert's Rules of Order, when something gets tabled and it's not brought back to council that next session, it becomes moot and the issue dies. Am I correct on that? Yes, sir. Okay, so that issue is dead. So this is our next process here. It says, we the undersigned eligible voting members of the Oglala Sioux Tribe do hereby request and compel to, number one, revise and elect the Oglala Sioux Tribal Treasurer at large at our next 2018 scheduled tribal election. Thereafter, the treasurer shall be elected at large in subsequent elections of the Oglala Sioux Tribe and shall be conclusive and binding on the Constitution of the Oglala Sioux Tribe. The treasurer shall be the custodial of all funds and assume a fiduciary role which come under the jurisdiction or control of the Oglala Sioux Tribe. The treasurer shall pay out all funds in accordance with the laws established by tribal council, shall keep accounts of all receipts, disbursements, and shall make monthly written reports to the Oglala Dakota Oyate, not just the council, to include the annual audit and to the tribal council at each regular or special meetings. The treasurer shall be bonded in such an amount as the tribal council shall require. Number three, the elected at-large tribal treasurer shall be subject to recall from office only under due process of law for caused by tribal courts. One appointed member from each of the 9 districts of the Oglala Sioux tribe appointed by the Oglala Sioux tribal courts, herein referred to as panel of appointed. The panel of appointed shall not consist of any current members of the tribal council. All 9 panel of appointed shall be present for a quorum. Upon 2/3 vote in the affirmative or recall by the panel of appointed, the treasurer shall be impeached. And by affixing my signature to this petition, I certify that I uphold this proposed constitutional change to the methods of electing, duties, and removal of the Oglala Sioux tribal treasurer. That's what we got. I mean, I've got. And right now, it's in its infancy stage because we don't know where to turn to now because the tribal council killed the issue. And since we're talking about constitutional revision, this is a time and place to discuss that. And I don't, I know that Jimmy disagrees with the way I promote myself, but I always tell James, I said, there's a time and place for everything, right, James? I mean, so I'm not here to portend a current tribal chairman or tribal council or anyone of that nature, but it's just the right that we have. Now that 30% is a very tough, is a tough thing to do because we don't have 30% voting in our tribal elections. We're lucky to get maybe 8,000. Now is it 30% of 8,000 or is it 30% of the perceived numbers of 25,000 or 50,000 that I hear? What is it? I guess that's my question. So I want to, I have my own issues of what you don't have to hold it for me, of what we need to talk about as far as the constitutional revision is concerned. So we need to keep in mind that this tribal council is a result of the treaty, not the other way around, and that if we point our fingers to the Secretary of the Interior, that's our fault. Because the original 1934 Act was to replace everything that every department that the Bureau of Indian Affairs had. And if we don't do that, it's our fault. In the Indian Self-Determination Act, under Nixon finally said, hey, let those Indians start managing their own affairs. I'm tired of telling them what to do and, things like that. And that's all on the internet. You can research that and get that kind of language. Ronald Reagan, when he said he was going to blow up Russia because of a newscast that he was supposed to give, and he didn't know that the camera was on. All those things are on the internet. We need to, and I get my information from the internet, not from some textbook. Okay, I've gone through answering your question, young lady, Dr. Merdanian. Okay. What? Merdanian. I will learn your name before too long. So, thanks.
I'm your other half, or Chris would say I'm the sugar half. But,
yeah.
I think more along this concepts of you and your style of, people want answers, we want this, we want that, It's like you said, the default lies within ourselves and our tribal government not doing what the people want, And that's where it's at.
Well, yeah,
Change comes from voting.
Right, and that's what I was here to do is...
Yeah, I'm not sure. That's why I got a thing from the VA on Tai Chi right here. It's really,
And that's the Article 6 is the section we need to work on as districts to define our roles as districts, to take back our power as districts. We can't continue to rely on our council people all the time. We have our own responsibilities as community members. And I think Oglala District is the first district to... Oh, sorry, my name is Kimberly Killer, and I'm from... Yeah, my dad's Francis. But Oglala is the first district to actually revise their community constitution, and that's where we need to start in every single district.
I like the decision you guys forced on that Oglala store. On that Oglala store, because we had that similar situation here. You know, we said any monies purchased from tribal funds belongs to the district. And that was a ruling that Wounded Knee went through, and they said, no, all those assets belong to the district. Well, here it's different. Here they say, no. We are, we're a nonprofit, we're a 501c3. That's been proven not to be in existence. But see, that's what we're hearing. I mean, I was asked by the district council to, not to advise, but see, I'm an accountant by profession. And so they wanted to know about my knowledge of what a business operation, how it functions, how it's assembled and so forth. So I was doing that. And Jim gets up and says, oh no, that's not true, because the school or the store is a 501c3 organization, right, Jim? Okay. And I said, if I had known that, I would not even be here today. And I go to find out that it wasn't. It isn't a 501c3. So see, that's what I mean by everybody's confused. I was confused in Allen because I didn't know that it was a 501c3, but later on through my research I found out that no, there is no such thing as 501c3 in Allen. The closest is the school that you just addressed, the school system. They didn't talk about the cemeteries or the churches or anything. So that's what, I guess that's what I'm here, and I like to talk to people that that will assist me in this type of a thing where I'm talking about this petition, because it's a situation where we out in the country, the landowners, are being really excluded from a lot of things. I always told Jim that I said this should not be considered Oglala Dakota housing, because it's not. It's Oglala Dakota HUD housing, because they don't help me. Yeah, I know you're on your own when I got a septic tank problem or a pipe burst, so it's tough, and I can't get no help anywhere. So I mean, I think that we should be given help based on our status as Indian, based on our status as tribal council or tribal representative, a tribal member. Okay, that's what I believe. I don't want a handout. I just need assistance. So I guess that's what I'm going to say.
Can I say something?
Sure.
Can I say something? I know I'm still ignorant of the way our Constitution is worded properly. I know I'm still ignorant of the way our Constitution is worded. But don't you think that what you discussed as far as your, don't you think that as far as what you discussed concerning your home could be written into the Bill of Rights? Make it a right to have those things repaired and fixed. And I know you're talking about monetary things, but I noticed the last thing that you discussed a minute ago was, say you have a septic issue, or say there's a problem with your home, you can't get help for it anymore. So that's why you're trying to move this through with council, right? What you were discussing. Would the Bill of Rights, since you're a doctor, would that fit into that area, ma'am? And is that something that you might want to put on your survey so that it can be addressed at council appropriately?
What you're all saying are really good points. And just for clarification, that's why we're here, is to give you all the necessary information to allow you to sit down and review these articles and saying, okay, is this a violation of my Bill of Rights? Or is it under Ordinance 19-73? So what we're trying to do is make sure that you understand that under these articles, we also have ordinances, that we as tribal council abide by these ordinances. In the Willard Howard Act of 1934 of self-determination, you're right, self-determination. That's why I gave that 4th grade history lesson, was to show that we have an opportunity as a people to become self-determined. But first, we need to define the self. Who are we as a people? That's our enrollment, okay? All of that, like you said, goes back to our treaties, our boundaries. It all ties together. It's holistic. But see, we've created segments and we separated it out through our Constitution. And with that being said, in our treaties is our allotments, our allowances, okay? We agreed upon this. This is a contract. Federal government said, okay, if we're taking your resources, we're going to give you these allotments, these allowances. For example, education. For example, with the rite of passage, we have that ownership of all of the resources regarding that rite of passage, the Commerce Clause. And we haven't exercised our Commerce Clause under economic development, under the state. We have every opportunity to do that as a people, but we as a people need to do that, not tribal council. Like I said, we have to determine that process from the treaties of how that money is going to be funneled down from the federal governments. Today, those allowances are called TPA, Trust Priority Allocations. Under these Trust Priority Allocations are known as our 638 programs. Under our 638 programs, our tribal government administers these funds to our people. And that's based upon our membership. Okay? So, if we are to revamp our government structure, then what is that going to look like? How are these resources going to be funneled down? How are they going to be administered? Who's going to do the housekeeping? And how are we going to enforce it? Who's going to enforce it? These are the questions that we as a people have to make sure that we have in place so that we run in a good way for our people.
Those that you just mentioned are listed in here.
So all of the articles that we talked about were, you know, with the amendments, we're up to Article 11 and the amendments. When you talked about, well, what number is that 1/3? 1/3 of the 30% of the voting population. 30% of the eligible voters, that's who you're looking at, that 30%, okay? Once you get your petition signed, you send that to the Secretary of Interior. Secretary of Interior will approve that, then send it back to the people. And when it comes back to the people, you have to have 1/3 of the eligible voters agree with your petition. Exactly.
I understand Secretary of Interior when it says the superintendent is going to run it, he's the representative.
Well, no sir, no sir. Times have changed with that legislation. And so with the Secretary of Interior back in the, I would say in the 70s, what happened is the Secretary of Interior's position got elevated in Congress. And because it did that, because it got elevated, then that's the ultimate say. Now, do we need to in the future have a secretarial election if we want to amend our Constitution? I don't know. That's up to the people. What I'm saying is that we have an opportunity to amend that. Yes. We have an opportunity to take that out. But it is you, the people, that need to say that. You, the people, who need to tell us these are the revisions we need to make.
And you also, right?
No, sir.
You're people, right?
At this point, we want it to come from the people.
Sure. Okay.
And that's why we're putting it out there, and that's why we're going to all 9 districts. We even have youth forums set up to go to the high schools. We also have meetings for those elderly who have knowledge about the treaties to come and give their input of how this should look when we do our revisions. So it needs to come from the people, because it's the people who own it. And as Ms. Killer talked about, what Kim said is we need to take that responsibility back, and we need to give and empower our districts again. So when we talk about Article 6, and I kind of touched on Article 6, saying we really need to look at Article 6 and giving that voice and that power back to the people. Because like you said, where does it go? When do we decide on something? And yes, we are selected to represent our people. So, you know, when I talked about Article 3, council's responsibilities, that's a part of that revision as well. That needs to come from the people. So I hope that makes sense, and it's really good comments. And going back to the Bill of Rights, what you talked about, the Bill of Rights was added in 2008. Prior to that, we did not have the Bill of Rights. Okay, on paper, we have the Bill of Rights. However, how are the Bill of Rights being exercised within our courts? How are we upholding our people's rights? For example, when the tribal courts charge these fees for courts and fines, when you're not guilty, you're innocent, right? Exactly. So you have to keep these in mind when I go through the articles, is that you as the people have the opportunity to say, this is a violation of our rights. We want this amended.
Yeah, I think I was surprised when the Bill of Rights was passed, because from my understanding, again, maybe a little bit more advanced American government, and something that it says that if there wasn't any kind of law that's in existence, then we go to the next level and use that law.
Exactly, and that would be the Indian civil rights.
Bill of Rights, and then go to the United States Bill of Rights and implement that down here. So that's why I thought that the Bill of Rights never was really an issue here, but I guess now that I see it, we can really turn it and limit it to the Bill of Rights for the code.
Correct, correct.
I guess my next question is, obviously, who's the non-Indian? I know. Anyway, Chris and I's idea of what a Lakota is a Lakota, but somebody else might say that we're Lakota. so the translation gets lost there, you know. So that's what.
I understand. So when we look at
What he didn't say, and it's coming out in this, in yet another newspaper article that says that IHS wasn't providing for all the people. Well, that's a tribal council, in my opinion, should question this guy. How many people sat and waited? And that guy should say, well, we only have one doctor. Well, it's our fault for not only having one doctor. We know we've got 25,000, we know we've got 50,000 people, but we've got one doctor. Whose fault is that? That's our fault. We don't tell IHS, you know, we need doctors in none of these districts. And what I'm getting at here is the United States of America only sees us as one rectangle in their budgetary process, whereas there's 9 rectangles in the budgetary process. So that IHS budget could be used up only in Allen. That budget could be used up only in Pine Ridge, but yet the whole reservation is having to do it. That's why we've got such a disproportionate amount of waiting time. It's not that we have lesser quality MDs or lesser quality RNs. It's just that, you know, hey, we only have one, and we've got, you know, 30 people sitting in a waiting room at the emergency room. That's our fault. That's my fault for not saying, you guys need more. You guys need to go out there and negotiate more monies for our IHS.
right.
Service management. It's the management in all these areas. My wife, the doctor, applied for a job up there. So use my veteran's preference too.
Wow.
You get an interview.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. Sure.
So you know, we all have, you know, stories regarding IHS. We all, generation after generation, have lived through this systemic process that has really hurt our people. It became a self-defeating process. So what we're trying to do is, the only way that we can grow and we can break this cycle of dependency is start with us and how we govern ourselves as a people. how we operate as a people and what are those values. You talked about the Tioshpaye concept. And a long time ago, within those societies, it was consensus. Today, it's majority rule. You said tribal council passed that report. Well, not all tribal council voted to pass those reports. So what I'm trying to say is that you got to keep in mind that with those of us who want to give our voices back to the communities, to the districts as council representatives, always don't have the support. One of us, two of us can sit there, three of us can vote no all day, but what good does that do? Because majority rules. So in order to change that is going back to this. So with that, you know, I really enjoy your comments, but let's try to move through this, and then at the end we can have more discussion. So in Article 13 talks about the responsibilities of the executive committee, and really the executive committee is supposed to handle the day-to-day operations of the tribe. However, the president has ordinances that they have to abide by, and their responsibilities and roles become very minimal. At this point, the president has no veto power, and you talked about going to DC. At this point, Congress, at that level, they only recognize the tribal government. It goes back to our treaties and the assignments of the headsmen known as chiefs, you know. So it goes back to that concept. Now, we talk about how we're going to change this and how are we taking that responsibility. Something that's been forced upon us. So let's look at this analogy. Basketball. Basketball is not a traditional game of our people, but yet our people embrace this concept, and they embraced it by accepting it and participating. And by participating, they started to first of all learn the rules. They learned the rules of the game, and they did it as a team. Not only that, they kept track of how well they were doing or how not so well they were doing. They learned the rules, they participated, and then they practiced. And then they practiced. And they got better and better and better at it. So we as a people need to keep that in mind when it comes to our government as a people, because we've changed as a people, and we have to keep that in mind. So now we need to make sure we learn those rules. The rules are already outlined. We gave you the rules. That's what we accepted. We participated. We've been participating in a constitution for how many decades now? A constitution that needs to come from us. And here's our opportunity. So this is where we can put all of those great ideas down on paper to help make these changes. So the qualifications of tribal council representatives, you talked about education. Well, right now, the criteria is you must be 30 years of age. It says 3 up there, but forget that. You must be 30 years of age. You must live within the boundaries of the Pioneers Reservation. And you have to, that's it. Reside within the boundaries and be 30 years of age, be a tribal member.
Yeah, I thought that was correct, because I skipped school in second grade. They were talking about
So with that type of, that's what it says is regards to the criteria. So we as the people, you know, there's other tribal nations who've done constitutional reform. Citizens Potawatomi, they're a tribal nation because the majority of their membership live off the reservations because the reservation is so small.
Which one of them?
Yeah, Prairie Island.
Which is Minnesota?
Yeah. So Yep, Wisconsin, that area. And so what they did is with their tribal government, how they set it up, is they have elected officials in different states, and their tribal council meetings, they all like FaceTime in or teleconference in, and that's how they make their decision, because a lot of their populations live in those metropolitan areas. So it does affect their people that live within those metropolitan areas. So that's you know, they're thinking outside of the box of how it's going to work for their people today, and they're setting the expectations for the future generations as well. So it's something to think about as we look about these qualifications for not only tribal council but for executive committee.
Pardon my interference with the presentation, but again, I've got some stuff I gotta get done in daylight hours. So my next, you just mentioned the idea of thinking outside the box. We can do that here on this reservation. We can think outside the box without neither increasing nor decreasing tribal funds. We can have subcontracts of each district. Each district operates as their own government as we're supposed to. You know, so in other words, I just referred to the IHS budget. That IHS budget, Allen should negotiate their own IHS budget every year, and so forth on down the line. Same thing with unemployment and with training. We should have our own training budget. Instead of having, I don't know how many slots that they may have now, there may be, 25, 30 slots that the government gives, because they recognize us only as a rectangle instead of the 9 political subdivisions. We should have 20 training positions here in Allen. So if that subcontracting grant, I mean, we decided to go subcontracting, we could be, in 1970, 1980, I made this proposal because I was a district chairman here. Just fresh out of school, that was back when I knew everything, right? I mean, we all went to that. I mean, maybe I'm the only one that went to that. But anyway, I proposed that. We went to tribal council to say, we want to subcontract every federal program that comes in here and bring it back to Allen, and we operate our own budget. With that, the consequences would have been, my projection was after 7 years of this form of government, we would have no people to place in their own private homes. Private, now I said private, I mean, I'm talking about out of the country, not tribally controlled houses, HUD houses. So that's what happened, and so that's what I'm here to see if anybody, because I was off on the wrong page back then, man. I mean, geez, nobody even thought of that, or nobody even looked at it, so they just said, no, we're not going to do it that way. So, we don't have that option. We don't, the school. You take the school, for example. That's one of the things that within my tribal council, within my district council allocation, we had that contracted from the BIA. My thing was, we're going to have Indian education. 25 years, it's going to be full of Allen people. We're going to have Allen superintendent, Allen administrators, Allen teachers, bus drivers, bookkeepers, accountants, whatever. Okay, logistics, we handle all the logistics of the ordering, whatever. You go down there now, there's not, well, maybe a couple people from Allen there. An Indian education? There is no Indian education. In fact, the superintendent of schools came down here and talked to the tribal council about criteria from the Southwest.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Wow, wait a minute, I mean, now are we talking national accreditation? Are we talking Southwest, or are we talking about, whatever, points of lights of Governor Janko or whatever, but that hasn't happened. Right. So we've got to figure out, what is it that we want, and I haven't figured it out, and so I think that by maybe attempting the treasurer to have him see this. So anyway, with that, if you guys don't have any questions, I gotta run, because I gotta go home. I'm
question. Sure. Why don't you take out a petition and run for office?
Well, again, I just got done telling you, I did. Okay, in 1980, I believe it was, I said, okay, I am going to become a politician. And then I said, I'm going to start with my local level. That's what I know. That's the managerial skills that were taught me in school. Okay? So that's where we did all this. You know, that's when I put that subcontracting program proposal together, and I put the school together. The school was going to operate, calculate janitorial supplies with a building that was left vacant. We were going to introduce a police academy. That was all documented. I mean, I didn't campaign. I went to everybody's house and said, look, here's what you're going to vote for. It's in writing. And if you want to do that, vote for me, and then we're going to get it implemented within 3 weeks of my term of office as president. We did. Tribal council met right here, and we presented the subcontracting agreement. They tabled it.
over here.
It's okay. I'm not a politician, so I refuse to do that. But I can say, here's a project we can work on, right? And I'd be willing to.
I have a question for you. I might need your help too. You seem like a very intelligent man, very informed.
Okay.
Can you wait 5 minutes before you leave, sir? I have a question for you since you're a doctor. I've spoken to my tribal representative, Jim Cross, and he says that he's willing to help me to approach the council for a lawyer who can represent me with issues that regard these treaty laws concerning my life. Under the context of military personnel, I was in the United States Air Force, and I feel that my treaty rights as an American Indian have been violated by foreign governments. And I've spoken with Jim Cross about it, and he's agreed to help me. Now I'm asking you as a doctor, I do trust Jim, but I'm asking you as a doctor, as our Constitution is written right now, and as these treaties have been written in the past, do you think that there's validity in what my representative is saying, that the tribal council possibly can approve a legal counsel for me to resolve these situations? That's my question, my concern. That's why I'm here today, you know, and that's why I asked you to stay, because I need your help as well.
What's your name?
My name is Jason Salway Sr., ma'am. Jason Lorraine Salway Sr. Yes, ma'am. I was in the United States Air Force, and I have issues that I need addressed, and Jim is willing to help me, you know, so.
Well, in regards to council assigning you an attorney to assist regarding violation of your treaty rights, with that being said, our people have been working on this for decades, and that's just all honesty. The other thing is that with the tribal attorney, what they can do is give you a legal opinion, but that has to come through committee action to be able to for an attorney to sit down with you and give you a legal opinion, but they will not advise you. They will just give you a legal opinion in regards to what you supply to them, okay? So they won't represent you in court, they won't do any of that. They'll just provide you with a legal opinion, okay? Because if we, as tribal council, try to intervene in regards to any type of court cases, it's called Section 19. It's an ordinance. We would be in violation of the Constitution of our own laws.
You would be in violation of the
Tribal council would be.
laws. Why?
Because that is an ordinance that was passed by tribal council. It is a tribal law that we do not intervene. Talking about trying to create that separation of powers, that we cannot intervene into any court cases as tribal council. So,
but I can approach the council for legal.
you can approach a committee to get a legal opinion. Yep, law and order. So that's where I would recommend you go. Because we're already at Article 15, which is the oath of office. And so with the oath of office is something that when we were, so Steffi and I are new tribal representatives, first time on council. We are not politicians. We are legislators. And so Stephanie's, yeah. So with that, when we were seated on December 6th, we took this oath of office. And the oath of office states in there that we will defend the treaties, defend the people. And so those words, personally, I took near and dear to my heart, that I would defend my people and the treaties. So that's why you see us here in supporting the task force to move forward to give the voice back to the people. Article 16 is meetings and procedures. This just outlines how the president will facilitate the tribal council meetings. When we are to have our meetings, we have our meetings the fourth Tuesday of the month is what it states within our constitution, and that we need to have 2/3 to make quorum in regards to our meetings. And if you've been listening to the council meetings, there's times that we are not able to have meetings because we do not have quorum, or because tribal council representatives have left to break quorum. So when we talk about procedures, I think there needs to be a table of penalties that fall under those procedures. The National Sioux Council, last article, Article 17. In the past, there was a chartered organization called the National Sioux Council, and tribal council would nominate an individual to serve on that National Sioux Council to represent our tribal nation. I believe this particular charter has phased out, and today we have a lot of treaty councils. We do. But that doesn't mean that's wrong or it's bad. It just means that we have so many people interested, and each one has a priority. And we as a people need to help them come together to align those priorities to help move it forward, to help our people. Because these treaty councils represent our tribal nation at the UN. And we need to start giving them our priorities as a people, how they should represent us, like Mr. Killer at the state level. How should he represent us at the state level? How should we be represented at the national level, at the federal level? How we should be represented at the international level. So we need to start thinking about that. Like I said, we have to learn the rules of the game, and we participated. It's time we start really engaging and start practicing this. So.
You mean the legislature?
Yeah.
You can.
But do you? Would you?
Oh, no, well, if it was directed from the tribal council, I support it.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, whatever they say, I support it 100%.
Okay.
Right. So that's where we are with this. And really, I think we need to start making this fit to all the different groups that we have here on the Pine Ridge Reservation representing us as a treaty council. Because also with this was a budget. It's a small budget, not a large budget, that gets pulled from general fund to help support those meetings and for people to attend treaty meetings and so forth. So with that, we're done. Hooray. You guys have the surveys. We handed them out. And just to let you know, these are the upcoming meetings. So right now we had Lake Creek, Pine Ridge, and Pass Creek. Those were the 3 meetings scheduled for today. The upcoming meetings that's going to happen is Oglala, Porcupine, and Wounded Knee, and those are scheduled for December 2nd, and those are the locations in which they're going to be held. So if you tell your relatives who couldn't be here today at Pass Creek that these are the upcoming district meetings, they can go and participate in the upcoming district meetings as well. And that they have a voice, and their voice is important. This is how we're going to build the change. And then on December 9th, we have coming up Wakbomni, Eagle Nest, and Medicine Road. So that's scheduled for December 9th, those 3 locations that will be running the constitutional reform meetings. And as I mentioned, we also have the youth forums. These are the 3 schools that are scheduled. Crazy Horse is December 5th, Pine Ridge is December 6th, and Little Wound is December 7th. So we also have a team that is going to go out to the youth and help the youth, and they're also going to do this survey. So the schools have already received the Constitution, they're reviewing them in their classes and as student council, and then they're going to come together. And also on November 30th, we have our reservation-wide youth councils coming together to talk about constitutional reform. So that's also happening because those are our future leaders, and that tribal government is not stagnant. We are here today. And what's really sad is that when you ask a 2nd grader, what do you want to be when you grow up? They say, oh, I want to be a policeman, or I want to be a nurse, or I want to be a doctor or a lawyer, or I want to be president of the United States, or accountant. But you don't hear them say, I want to be tribal president. I want to represent our tribal nation. You don't hear that. So it's time we build that pride back in who we are as a people. No longer being ashamed of who we are and where we come from, but empowering our people to be proud of who we are. We survived this long, and we need to prepare those future generations to survive longer. So with that, we also have our elders meetings that are coming up, those who have knowledge of the treaties. We had one at Prairie Wind Casino, and it went quite well on December 18th. Even though there was a treaty meeting going on in Laura Brule, we had a pretty good turnout. So Porcupine is December 10th, Wombly is December 16th. So those are the upcoming.
That's supposed to be November.
Oh, sorry. So this one, I think this download is the old PowerPoint presentation because I changed those dates. I think that's why we're having problems. This is an old presentation, but that was November 18th. We did have that. Okay? So with that, keep in mind, here are the links that you can go to, the tribal website. We have a page for constitutional reform. We have the survey because we want all of our tribal citizens to have an opportunity to fill out this survey and give their voice, their input. We also have it on Facebook. There's a Facebook link, and then the OST Constitutional Reform Facebook. So all of these, you can find the schedules of the upcoming meetings. You can find the surveys as well as the constitutions and the treaties. So with that,
Can you go back to the website, please?
sure. So with that, I want to say Pilama Yaye. I thank all of you for coming and staying and listening and engaging. And sometimes just by listening, it's very important because that's how we learn and be able to understand other people's perspectives. And thank you for listening to me because I sure enjoyed hearing your questions and your concerns and your ideas as well as your comments. So Pilama Yaye. Thank you.